There she is. Okay, so for our case study, we're looking at a neuroscience team who's looking at the physical functions of a young woman, which is why there's an X on the picture. I liked the picture, but it was of a man. So anyways, we have Bobbie, and she was in a car accident that severed her femoral nerve. So pictured here, we have our lumbar plexus, right, and the various branches that end up merging to give us our femoral nerve, which extends down to the anterior portion of the thigh. There's also branches that go down into the anterior shank and medial shank, so keep that in mind, but primarily our innervations are in the thigh, okay? But for the sake of this example, let's say that she severed her nerve right at the top next to her inguinal ligament, okay? So just put that in your head as we're answering questions. So we're going to go over how reflexes might be affected, motor function, as well as sensory function. So just kind of reflecting back on the knee-jerk reflex pathway that we talked about, how might that pathway be affected if this femoral nerve is severed? Will there be a reflex?
Wouldn't there not be a reflex because you're blocking, if you're cutting the nerve, which carries both sensory and motor, it wouldn't be able to, the sensory wouldn't be able to pass up to the spinal cord, and the motor wouldn't, therefore, would not even have a response.
Right. Okay, so these bundles in the plexus are mixed, meaning that there's both sensory and motor information, or sensory nerves and motor nerves that pass through these bundles, right? So the muscle spindle, again, is responsible for detecting the stretch, and then it has afferent neurons attached to it that send information to the spinal cord. Well, if we have this cut off here, we block that communication going up, but then that also means motor neurons never get the signal that there's stretch happening, right? So then we can't effectively produce a motor response by contracting the agonist muscle and inhibiting the antagonist, which is a different pathway for the antagonist because that's a different nerve in the body. But generally, we can't sense, we can't produce the reflex. Okay, so there would be no reflex in that case. If we look at overall motor function and how the femoral nerve innervates her leg, right? What kind of activities might be difficult for her to do?
Walk?
Yeah. Generally anything that is forward facing, right? Does anyone know what the common action is between the rectus femoris, the sartorius, and the pectineus? If you look at their line of pull, they all have origins around the pelvis and insertions down on the femur.
Is it like flexing the hip?
Yeah, flexing the hip, which is very important for walking. Okay. What do the quads do as a muscle group? Or what's their primary action?
Extension.
Yeah, extending the knee. Also very important in walking, right? But also very important in sit to stand movements, if she had to go upstairs. Right, there's a lot of daily functions that we don't even think about for hip flexion and knee extension. So pretty much any activity that involves these muscles functioning, right, is going to be potentially problematic. Okay. But kind of going off of that idea where we lose function of our anterior thigh muscles, right? Do we still have any movements or activities that might still be possible?
Flexing the knee.
Flexing the knee? What muscles do that?
Hamstring.
Hamstrings, among some others, right? So how might she maintain use of her hamstring muscles as an example? Does anyone know how the posterior muscles of the leg are innervated? Is it by the femoral nerve? No, right? Because the femoral nerve is innervating the anterior portion of the leg. And if that's the nerve that's affected, then we're kind of only going to see motor deficits in the anterior side of the leg, right? But if we look at the sacral plexus, there's another set of nerves that go to the posterior side of the leg, right? Through our sciatic nerve and various branches of the sciatic nerve, right? We can see we still have use of our glute muscles, we have use of our hamstrings, some of our adductors, as well as extensions down into the calf region, right? So this is great, right? Because we can still activate a lot of muscles in our leg. So maybe she can't produce hip flexion for a walking motion, but she could adopt a circumductive walking pattern where she's pretend this is my hip joint, or she could use her glute muscles on the lateral side of her hip to create abduction to kind of swing her leg around so that she could still walk. Or maybe she walks backwards instead. I don't know. Okay. But the human body is pretty cool in the sense that when we lose function in one part of our body, we can retrain activation patterns to allow us to still complete activities. So even though anterior side of her thigh has no more motor function, she still could potentially compensate using all of these posterior muscles, right? So maybe in like a sit to stand, we have both hip extension and knee extension happening, right? Knee extension part would be really difficult because her quads aren't functioning properly, but maybe she develops more strength in her hip extensors to help her kind of overcome that functional obstacle, right? So tragic accident, but possibilities are still there, okay? So that's motor function. If we look at the leg of sensory function, no pun intended, I just realized that. But we've got sensory information that could possibly be affected. We already talked about this in the sense of the muscle spindle, but what about skin sensation? Where might she have numbness or tingling? Where does the nerve?
Would it be in her quadriceps?
Yeah, basically any anterior, maybe part of the medial side of her leg, right? And that extends all the way down, possibly to the shank, where nervous connections are being cut off as well, right? So, skin sensation, think of all the different types of receptors that are in the skin. Okay, because there's mechanoreceptors, proprioceptors, we have thermoreceptors, right? Any deformation of the skin, heat sensation on the skin, we don't get that information anymore. Okay, so but generally all located, again, wherever this femoral nerve is innervating the leg. Okay, so if we kind of put motor and sensory deficits together, what might happen structurally to her leg as a whole?
Wouldn't it be easier for her too to like sustain pain to that? Like she might hurt herself more in that region because she can't sense anything.
Yeah, right. So sensory impairment could lead to physical impairment, right? Maybe something hot drops on her leg, she can't sense the temperature change, so she might get burned, right? Or she steps on something. I don't necessarily know, I can't remember extending down into the foot necessarily where the receptive fields are from anterior innervation, but maybe withdrawal reflexes might be inhibited because feeling is diminished as well, right? So she could step on something and maybe impale her foot, and you'd never know, right? But yeah, so sensation is potentially problematic, right? Because also we have proprioception, or use sensory information from the environment to understand where our body is in space. Okay, so she still has like visual affirmation or confirmation of where her leg is, but purely sensory alone would be a little bit difficult. Okay. What about in terms of motor impairment? Because or looking at the motor deficits. Because if you don't use your muscle, what tends to happen to it?
Atrophy.
Atrophy. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're gonna end up losing muscle mass. Okay, if you think about, if any of you have ever had a cast before and your arm or leg shrinks because it's not getting used, right? So atrophy would occur, loss of muscle mass, and overall muscle weakness. Okay. But we also know when we talked about bones that muscle is really important in bone formation, right? So, and the quads are they're mostly impacted by this innervation, but the quads produce a lot of force, right? They're a very strong muscle group, thus they're placing a lot of stress on the femur in various actions, right? So we kind of lose a decent amount of stress placed on the bone. Therefore, we kind of have a proportional decrease or potential proportional decrease in bone formation. So she might also have a loss in bone density. That is a little bit more of a hypothetical speculation, but it's possible. Okay. So, any questions on the case study as a whole? All right. Before we wrap up, Brian, did you have any study tips or things that you think people should focus on for this section?
Not really. Jay does love the stretch reflex, so I become really familiar with that. You're going to see it on everything from now on. That's about it.
Awesome. All right. Well, one thing before we take off that I wanted to mention is that, to my understanding, the way that student evals are working this semester is that you're only evaluating the lecture portion of the course. So TAs don't get information about how you thought labs went. So I made a survey. I'll put the link in the chat. But if you can take like 5 or 7 minutes to go through that, that would be super helpful. I wanted to send or get a response to our last TA meeting. So if you could finish it by next Thursday, that would be great. And then basically it's just kind of questions on how you thought lab was run, if there was a certain structure that you preferred, or if there's short answer opportunities too if you think there's potential suggestions for how to make your experience better. I know this was a very interesting semester, and this discussion part is brand new for this course. So any information we can get on how you guys thought it ran is very helpful. So I'll send the link out again on Friday if you don't have time to do it now, but that would be much appreciated. So other than that, that's all we have for this week. So I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
The slight
Thank you.
weather.
Thanks.